Let's go.
We have all heard it before.
Public officials and other critics have raised concerns about the role of media and culture, particularly violent video games.
Across more than a few of our message boards, we've seen more than a few people raise concern over violent video games.
It's happening in virtually every developed country in the world. Young people, usually boys, unable to walk away from online video games.
Playing video games does not put food on their families' tables. The effects of changing technology on labor markets will likely have repercussions for years to come.
As a mother, I would just say step away from the screen, go outside, get some fresh air. Beating Tetris is not a life goal.
Video games cause violence. Video games are a waste of time. Video games are for losers who live in basements. Video games are just pixels on a screen. Go outside and do something useful. Anyone who has played games has heard this refrain. We hear it everywhere, from social media trolls to news anchors to politicians. And no doubt, there may be a sliver of truth to some of these criticisms in certain instances. Virtually anything under the sun can be pathologized. And we aren't here to resolve those empirical claims today. But like most things, games are not a monolith. There are positive aspects to them too. Video games teach us skills. They inspire us. They dazzle our imaginations in ways that no other media can. Their immersion and interactivity enable us to experience how our actions affect broader worlds. And in many ways, games are a tool, a means at our disposal to better understand the world around us, as well as the people and the powers that inhabit it. And it's that positive aspect of gaming that we'd like to discuss today, which brought Zeff and I to ask a very simple question. What real-life skills have we learned from games, and how do we use them today? This is Lessons from Gaming, or LFG. I'm GavelGamer, or Gav for short.
Hey everybody, this is ZeffEpics, Zeff for short.
LFG is where we explore the real-life lessons we glean from the games we play on the screen. Now normally, this is when we'd issue a spoiler warning, but we see no need to do that formally today because we don't think we are going to remotely get into spoiler territory. Nevertheless, we never know where our discussion will lead, and so if we begin tending into a portion of a game that you think might be spoilers, do your due diligence, avoid spoiler sadness, and just maybe skip ahead a couple seconds. My gaming experience began when I was about 3 years old, and the first game that I played was Super Mario Brothers for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. It was a tough game for me at first. I kept dying at the first set of Goombas, and that was because I didn't understand a very simple concept, and that was running, sprinting, and jumping all at the same time. And my sister can tell you, she watched me play that game, I just could not get past that first set of Goombas. I just kept on dying. But once I mastered that skill, once I reached that epiphany where I could do that and get past the Goombas, I was off to the races and the sky was the limit. As an aside, I'll just say that I think that's actually a foundational skill. Having 4 kids and watching them all play games, watching them run and jump in one direction and doing that at the same time is a foundational skill. That was my first foray into games. Now, while Mario was my first game, it certainly wasn't the most formative for me, not by a long shot. The most formative game for me probably was the very next game that I played, which was the original Legend of Zelda. So just to set the stage, I would watch my dad play that game for hours at a time. And I immediately knew that it was very different than Mario. The game seemingly had everything for me, especially as a young kid, a young boy in particular. It had swords and magic and dungeons and puzzles and a searchable world, forests and mountains, no time limit. The world was my oyster, and I knew that I wanted to be a part of that game. But here's the problem. I was 3. How could I possibly play the original Legend of Zelda? How could I solve the riddles? How could I even purchase items? And so I set out to understand. And so just as a baseline, at this point, I was about 3 or 4 years old. I knew my letters A through Z, kind of, and I knew numbers 0 through 9. I knew vaguely what rupees were. I knew that I could purchase items, and I had become dexterous enough from Mario that I could kind of fend off enemies, but I didn't really understand the mechanics of the game. And so what I started to do was I started to watch what happened to my rupee count after clearing off screens of enemies at first. Particularly, screens with lots of enemies in them that dropped a lot of money, like Tektites and Octoroks. And I noticed certain patterns. that orange rupees would increment my rupee total by 1, and the blue ones by 5. And then I started committing to memory the relationships between certain numbers: 0 and 5, 1 and 6, 2 and 7, 3 and 8, 4 and 9, and the reverse. And then I started noticing the last digit in the rupee number would cycle 0 through 9, and every time it did, the number to the left of it would go up by 1. I eventually learned that that was a tens digit. And the same thing happened for the third digit when the tens digit went from 0 to 9. This was the hundreds digit. And so what I would start doing is I would begin to predict my rupee count after clearing off screens of enemies. And after a while, I got quite good with it. And so by the age of 3, I had taught myself the concept of addition and double and triple digit numbers just by playing The Legend of Zelda. But it wasn't just adding, the numbers also went down. Arrows would decrease your rupee count by 1. The original Zelda didn't actually have a separate arrow inventory number, it used your rupees. But then even buying items, every item in the game had an associated price, and I began to predict how much money I would have left after I bought certain items. And that was particularly kind of tricky with the red potion that had 68 rupees in it, which required fairly significant subtraction in your head when you're 3 and 4 years old. But by doing that, I began again to predict the rupee count that I would have after I would go through a shop, and I taught myself subtraction. And so before I knew it, I was about 4 years old, and I had taught myself addition and subtraction up through the numbers 255, which was obviously the highest number that you could get in rupees in the original Legend of Zelda, because that's FF and hexadecimal. But it wasn't just the original Legend of Zelda. I continued to love that series, and so the next main game was Zelda 2, loved that game. And then A Link to the Past came out for the Super Nintendo. This was a much more complex game. It had more narration than Legend of Zelda and had a much larger world. And so what my parents did is they bought me the strategy guide. And I would go to bed poring over this thing, particularly the maps. There was just another problem, though. I didn't really know how to read. I knew a couple of words, a couple 3-letter words, 2 and 3-letter words, but that was about it. I could understand the maps just fine, but I really wanted a deeper understanding of what this guide was teaching me. And so with the help of my parents, I began to teach myself, with their help, phonics. I would read or try to read aloud, and my parents would help me. And I vowed to myself something very simple. I said, I will never ask them to help me with the same word twice. And so I kept reading, or trying to read, and kept trying to read, and learning, and reading, and learning. And eventually, I learned how to read the entire book, as well as every word in it. I learned some things that were easy, like Death Mountain. Those were obvious, but it also improved my vocabulary. As a 5-year-old, I think at the time, I learned what misery was, distress. I learned what a mire was. It was another word for a swamp. I learned how to read things like Tower of Hera. Who was Hera? And that got me on and opened the door to things like Greek mythology. So at the age of 5, The Legend of Zelda not only taught me triple-digit addition and subtraction, it taught me how to read maps and how to glean information from a 168-page storybook and strategy guide. And so when it became time for my show and tell in kindergarten, I didn't bring in a stuffed animal like a lot of other kids did, or a sports memorabilia. What I brought in was my Legend of Zelda Link to the Past strategy guide. And that's what I showed the class, and I showed them how much that meant to me. And that's what I brought in for kindergarten. But another thing that I had learned from games, at that time, The Legend of Zelda came out, I believe, in North America in 1992. And before then and shortly thereafter, I had also gone on to play other types of genres, JRPGs in particular. So I had played Dragon Warrior for the NES, I had played Final Fantasy I for the NES, and then I also began to play slightly more story-based games, like Final Fantasy IV, and Final Fantasy VI, and Chrono Trigger. And more than the Legend of Zelda series, what these games showed me was the power of a moving narrative. The plot was not just to rescue some distant princess in a tower somewhere. It was learning about the histories and the motivations of characters like Cecil and Kain and Terra and Celeste. And I began to see how their stories had the power to communicate truths and ideas that would be otherwise difficult to communicate in another way. So for Cecil, for example, I saw the power of redemption. With Tara and Locke and Celeste, I saw the importance of overcoming trauma and transcending it to bring about positive changes in the world. And that, to me, I saw that more and more becoming more and more important in my everyday life. And even to this day, I've learned that that's one way that you can actually get a child to be quiet. It's one of the things that you can do is, if you want to get a child's attention, is you can begin telling them a story, and you will see almost immediately that that child will calm down and begin listening, because everyone wants to hear a good story. And so math, reading, and story were the things that really leapt out to me when we had asked this question, what skills had we learned from gaming? But another question is, how do we apply it today? Well, for me, it actually set the background for everything I have done since then, and even continue to do to this day. So for math, Legend of Zelda taught me math. I also double majored in mathematics and physics. It set the stage for my entire collegiate career. But more than that, the reading, yes, we all read today, but I'm not just reading anything, I'm a patent attorney. So not only do I have to read through material, I have to read through very technical and detailed material on an everyday basis where math and science is important. So the math and the reading are both interplaying into that invocation. But then story. Again, I'm not just a patent attorney, I'm also a trial and appellate litigator. So I need to build compelling cases for judges and juries today. And part of that requires understanding what will move people, what will inspire people, what people will find credible, how someone on the street might react to a particular story or fact or piece of evidence. And it's the stories that I learned from the games, the stories from Final Fantasy, the stories from Chrono Trigger, the stories from other Super Nintendo games and N64 games, that really taught me brought me a foray into a much broader world about the power of a compelling story, which is things that I still use today. And so for each of these items from games, math, reading, and story, it's not just something I use vaguely. These are lessons that defined who I was and who I am, not only going through college, my job, but my career and my life as a professional and as a father, watching other people, my kids, for example, play these games, building my own adventures for them, using stories and using puzzles, for example, that I've learned in The Legend of Zelda, or Myst, for example, and the old Apple II GS computer system. Using similar types of environmental puzzles for them. They love those types of things, and it brought us hours of enjoyment just as a dad and as a husband. I think that another thing that games really taught me is a similar lesson I learned from sports, which was the importance of making adjustments. When you go to a boss room, you generally can't repeat a bad tactic over and over and over again and expect to win. If you go in with a bad strategy, you're pretty much going to get your head handed to you, no matter how many times you do it. If you keep repeating the same bad tactic, you will not win. And so you need to make adjustments. You need to develop a better pre-fight strategy. You need to look for tells. You need to improve your execution. And I think those skills are readily applicable to everyday life. When something doesn't work, you have to think about it more. You have to develop a better strategy. You need to make adjustments. Again, it's the same type of adjustments that you might make in sports. For example, I played baseball for a long time. I was a pitcher. If your fastball isn't moving as much as usual, then you need to make an adjustment for that. If your slider isn't biting as much, you need to make an adjustment. And if you don't, then either the hitters are going to take off on it, or you won't hit your spots and you lose the game, or you won't do as well. You need to make those real-time adjustments. And I think games are another way of teaching that very important life skill about making adjustments on the fly in real-life environments, not only in sports, but just in life. When something isn't working, when you're doing something and it's not working, you need to change your tune. You see this in kids, and I see this again as a father of 4 kids all playing games. There's a big learning curve, I think, for a lot of kids when they go into boss rooms, or they have a particular tactic that they want to use and they keep losing. One of the things that I always teach my kids is trying to teach them how to make adjustments, how to change what they're doing, how to, again, develop better strategies, look for tells, improve their execution, looking for ways to, abuse certain tactics, for example. And they have found that to be very helpful as they have now begun playing games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, games like that, Kirby and the Forgotten Land. They will use those types of tactics to get through games. And when they do, you can just see the sense of achievement on their face. And I think that that's a skill that they will continue to use, not only in their games, but also in life in general.
I want to start with your lead off, which I thought was extremely well put. And it very much applied to why we have this entire show. The premise of this show is that there are lessons from gaming and they matter. So I just want your thoughts around this question. It's kind of an open-ended one, but why do you think that we as gamers can see these patterns or these translatable skills, but society and some of the individuals that maybe do not game, they have a difficulty seeing that?
Sure. I think that for some of it, there's going to be a divergence in expectation and reality. And so I think when people think of games, they may have something in their mind about what that might mean. It's just sort of pixels, hitting someone, it's just kind of raw consumption, pixels flying into someone's face, and no thought is involved. There's nothing else going on. And I think that might be, I think that's falling out of favor these days. I think as gaming has become much more mainstream than it was in the 80s and 90s, that conception of gaming has changed, but it still, I think, may pervade certain spaces, at least maybe those of certain age groups and backgrounds. But I think that for people who play games, particularly more complex games, gaming isn't just, like some, mindless drone thing that you do. Certain games can be like that, but games also can be an avenue to wildly different experiences. You can play a very moving game with a very intricate story, for example. You can hear some of the best music and some of the most moving and emotional and evocative music that you may ever hear in your life in games. Just as a brief aside, I actually love watching professional musicians, for example, react to certain video game soundtracks, because almost to a person, all of them will express an unbelievable surprise and satisfaction in how beautiful and how moving certain video game soundtracks can be. The other day, I was watching a reaction to Torna's battle music, and it was, it's this heavy, fast jazz, big band piece, and the musician was just absolutely in almost a state of euphoria because of how complex, how musically complex that piece is, about how beautiful and moving it is. And so, again, video games are this avenue to, they're not just, again, pixels hitting us on a screen. I think that's a very reductive way of viewing games. They're much more than that. They're stories, they're music, they are lessons, they are math, they are science, they are ideas. I think we talked about this last week, how video games are distillations of ideas, like really core ideas, not only about us, but about sort of physics and, again, heavy gameplay. And so those are things that I think that's why partially explains why there's a disconnect between maybe some of the perception and then the reality. So sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question, but
no,
I think
I loved it. The other phrase that you used that I loved is you said that games are a tool. And I thought about that a little bit as you said that, and then I listened to how you used it as a tool in your development as a child into an adult and continue to use it with your children and others. And I think that's a really important word, because I think one of the elements that people neglect to understand about games when from a societal lens is how they can serve as a tool. They are a tool in our tool belt to help refine and shape our skills. When you talk about it in a reductive manner, as you said, as just a form of media and entertainment, you neglect to realize that there is interaction in it, right? So when I go and binge watch a show on Netflix, it's enjoyable, it's entertainment. When I go watch movies, it's enjoyable, it's entertainment. And certainly the creative parts of my mind are lighting up and they're drawing connections and doing stories, but there's no interaction. It's not a tool, it's pure entertainment. So it's interesting to me always as a gamer that people can look at something like movies or television shows and binge watching those things as somehow a good use of time. But then there's all those things that you talked about with games. There's this high level arrogance of sorts that says, oh my gosh, how can you play video games? That's so beneath me. But you're learning a skill, right? And that's the part that I think is critical.
Yeah, just two quick things. I'd love to hear where you're going to go with this. I guess the first is just to your point. Movies and books are obviously very refined forms of media and art. And the thing about video games is I do believe that most video games, if not all of them, are art in a way. And I think that the reason why is because video games can touch on both of the reasons why books and film can be moving and evocative, but it adds yet another layer. So, for example, video games can have a nice narrative and have a very moving narrative in the way that books can. They can also delve into things that you might experience more with cinema and film, like lighting and staging, things like that you wouldn't see in books. But what games add to that, in addition to all of those things, is they add that element of interactivity and that idea of physics and world and presence. And that's something that you can't get anywhere else. You can't really, short of like these kind of silly, choose your own adventure books, which, it's the same thing every time. Not to knock those books necessarily, they're great when you're learning how to read, but it's just a different level. It's a different depth of interactivity that you just can't get anywhere else. And I think that it's that interaction that allows for a deeper understanding of our world, of certain ideas. And just the second real quick thing I wanted to say is I actually watched this happen with my own children too. So I watched my oldest daughter learn in a very similar way how to do double-digit subtraction by playing Dragon Quest Builders 2. So she had certain things that she needed to build, and so she knew that, for example, she had 15 blocks of redstone or whatever this stone was that she was using, and she knew that she would need 7 pieces, for example, to build it. And before she had even learned this stuff at school, she began to find the same patterns that I had been finding as a kid and realizing, oh, if I have 15 and I need 7, I would begin to ask her, how many do you think you're going to have left? And at first it was a little bit difficult, and then you could see her working through it, and eventually she would get the answer 8, and then quickly and more quickly, she would be able to answer these questions. And so I saw that same development that I had seen in myself. I saw that in her, and that was a really moving piece for me.
I really loved the part where you were talking about watching your dad, and I am interested in his influence on you during that time, because there's what you're seeing on the screen, but there's also the interaction between you and your dad that I would be interested in knowing more about. But I want to say it's very cool to hear that, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? You had much of that just from watching and playing Legend of Zelda. But the part that really stuck out to me, and it maybe relates to how your dad influenced you as you watched him play, but there's obviously IQ, and then there's EQ, there's emotional intelligence. And as you described the Final Fantasy and the Chrono Trigger and all that experience, you saw this transition of learning from IQ to EQ. This is where you were talking about formative skills that you developed in your emotions. And I'm just interested, as a gamer now, where do you see more of that learning coming? Do you see it more in your regular intelligence or your emotional intelligence, or both equally?
Good writing is something that you feel. It's not something that you really can be taught. You can learn skills, you can get experience with it, but it's something that you kind of have to feel. You have to kind of live in the world a little bit before I think the power of words really moves you and hits you. And so that is the skill that I see more translated today that I tend to use more and more. And just real quick about my dad, everyone's family life is very different. And I happen to be blessed with a paragon of a father. And he was and is everything that I try to set out to be. He was the smartest man in virtually any room that he walked into, but he was also the most humble and nicest man that I knew. And so having him in my presence all the time, watching him play these games, learning from him away from and close to the screen was something that really meant a lot to me. So watching it, The Legend of Zelda moved him for very similar reasons as it moved me. I mean, he was someone who loved beauty, the similar things that we talked about last week, right? What kept you going over the next hill? He was an adventurer in his mind as well. He was always exploring in his own mind. He would explore the cosmos. He was a physicist. He was a PhD physicist, and he was a really, really, really smart guy. But then he'd also be the kind of guy who would just talk to you about pizza, his favorite pizza or burger joint, and he could riff with you about that for 5 hours, and that's what you'd talk about. And he could move in between all of these worlds seamlessly, and that was something that I really respected. He had the most detailed maps of The Legend of Zelda that I've ever seen. So he made them on graph paper. He used like a drafter's pencil to make these maps and had the most beautiful, pristine maps of every Legend of Zelda dungeon and overworld screen that you could possibly imagine. And remember, this is before the internet was really a thing. I mean, the internet really wasn't a thing sort of in the 80s, at least not in any meaningful way. And we didn't have anything like that. We couldn't just go onto GameFAQs, or we couldn't just go onto a website and just pluck off a map. You kind of had to make it yourself, or subscribe to Nintendo Power, or get something through some print media. But if you didn't have that, I mean, I think that he bombed, for example, almost every block in the overworld screen to see if there was a cave there, a hidden cave. He burned every single tree, and he would put those into his maps. And so just being close to that type of energy, being close to that type of person, I think really drove me to want to be like that. It showed me what games can do. It showed me the doors that would open and the adventures that I could have, even as a 3 or 4-year-old, learning about games, learning from him. And so I think it was both of those things combined: his energy, his wisdom, but also his oversight and the power of games that in part made me what I am today.
Yeah. And honestly, man, it just goes to show how you can have those role model interactions as a parent or a uncle or a cousin or a friend to kind of help influence and help others grow and learn if you are doing it in the right way. And it sounds like your dad was just rock solid in every way, but particularly in this area of your life, he really made games for you a learning moment. That's
Right.
why this question stuck out to you and I, is because your dad had a way of making a game more than these insults, essentially, that are thrown out about them by the layman and non-gamers all the time. So, but thank you so much for sharing all that. I love hearing about your evolution into games and how much you learned. And it's just fascinating for me to listen to you talk about how you applied adult math skills and grit. You forced yourself to not allow yourself to be given the answer more than once. I love that. Learning grit at that age, that is so formative. You can't even think about how much that did for you in life, and so grit is one of the hardest skills to learn. And so you learned it in the gaming, and that's just incredible. When I was younger, Blizzard was almost bigger than Nintendo for me. And I was a pretty avid Nintendo fan. So like you, I was very into Mario, very into Zelda, played all the ones when they first came out. But Blizzard, the company Blizzard, was huge. I was very much into all of their games. Warcraft, I remember the very first one that I ever played. I would stay up late to play as a kid with my family. We would go down to family reunions, and my uncle had an office, and he would take us at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And I'm very young at this point. I mean, not so young that I it was irresponsible, but very young. And it was so fun for me. I got to go with the adults and the big kids, and we would go to this office, and he had this LAN duels that we played mostly Age of Empires because that was my uncle's game, but he would concede and let us play Warcraft and Warcraft 2 eventually. And I just remember so many memories of playing those real-time strategy games with my brother. I was 7 years junior to him. I will humble brag here that I used to beat my brother despite being 7 years his junior, which was a lot of fun. Great memories in those. And I will point out, though, of one of significance for me was in March 1998. I was very excited about the release of a game called Starcraft. It was the Warcraft 2 successor of sorts. I just remember seeing videos and I was so excited for it. There were the 3 boxes in that release, and you got to pick which one you want. It was just kind of an interesting release. I got the Protoss one. So if you got the Terran one or the Zerg one, cool. But I ended up getting the Protoss one. I just thought the Protoss were so cool. And it turned into a game that I relate so many skills, and I've jotted down 3. I could jot down 50, but I'm gonna only talk to 3 that kind of stood out to me. But I would stay with my cousin up late playing this. We had the dial-up with the weird AOL login sounds, to connect to each other just to play. I'm showing my age. That's why anybody that watching on video, you can see the gray in my beard. This is where it comes from. But it was just so much fun, and I learned so many skills. And I'll start with the first one, which was I learned the important principle of prioritization from that game. So I didn't realize it at the time, but there is a methodology called the Pareto method. And it really operates off of this assumption that 80% of results usually come from 20% of effort. That's the Pareto principle, something that I still use in my adult life. And the game really forces that upon you. You learn this Pareto method that 20% of what you're doing is actually what's going to turn in and translate into the results, because not everything matters. And so you have to prioritize correctly. And there are so many moments playing StarCraft where you just realize that you have to make your priorities something that will turn into the likelihood of success. And if you try to do everything all at once, or if you try to manage everything, you're going to fail. So I think that was the first one. And it also debunks multitasking. There's so many studies on why multitasking is not what we've made it societally, but I do know that one that came to mind that I read is in 2021, there was one that talked about how only like 2.5% of the population is good at multitasking, because people that multitask consistently show that they get less done. They have poor recall and memory, and they have worse attention spans. So that was my first skill, is prioritization. And I really think I learned that from games more than anything else in my life. The second one, you talked about this one a little bit, Gav, but it was around strategic decision making. There is a big debate for people amongst where our personalities come from. Is it nature? Is it nurture? And the answer is always, in most things in psychology, both. It's usually both. But we attribute, typically in studies, they attribute the nature elements to somewhere between 30 and 60%. Depends on the person, and it depends on the skill. They've kind of proven in 2018, there was a really interesting study around how there were about 700 genes that they isolated that could predict personality types of certain people. So it's really fascinating how there's this like dichotomy of nature versus nurture. But there are 5 areas that tend to be a little bit more nature in mind. And I only bring this up because they are openness, which are your ability to be creative or trying new things; conscientiousness, which is your high-level thoughtfulness, your goal-directed behaviors; your extroversion, introversion. Extroversion tends to be more of a nature versus nurture; your agreeableness, and your neuroticism. But like under the conscientiousness, the goal-directed behaviors, it's really critical that you develop and you hone that skill. And I wonder how much of playing that StarCraft game, where I had to make strategic decisions was formulated and that nurture was developed in that really young childhood of mine of needing to decide, because you are making decisions around resources. You're making decisions around which units are okay to die. You're making decisions on where to send them and what to do with them once they get there. And there's all this strategic skill making that you have to do during this that really just, I'm sure, grew my skills in strategic decision making. And I tend to be, I've taken many workplace assessments, and analytical, strategic always comes up very high for me. Whether that was I was born that way or just constantly playing real-time strategy games in like Starcraft contributed to that, I don't really know, but I don't really care, because I'm just so happy that I had an outlet to continue to hone and refine it. And then the last one is around just simple creativity and my tech skills. Starcraft had this very cool tool called the map editor. That was my first foray into declarative code, which I'm in engineering now. I'm a tech executive. Declarative code is simple code that you can do through a UI, but it has this really cool setup where you can, after you build your world, you can say, when this unit walks over to this spot, have this trigger occur and then do this, and you can create units or whatever. And people just got super creative in this thing. There were games that were games within Starcraft. Just the ability to create engines and logic and algorithms and things like that. I got practice in all of those things in that game. I don't think I would have ended up in tech. Obviously, you talked about this last time. I have a background in psychology. What kept me in tech is games like Starcraft, doing declarative code, learning these things. It was just fascinating for me to learn how to write simple code, not what developers or engineers do today, but just simple code. It was fun. And they made writing code fun, which is hard to do. So, and I'll just end with, there were creations that I had saved on my parents' computer. I wish I could go back in time and gather some of the creations that I made inside of Map Editor to this day. I remember them so well, but I lost them, and I just wish that I wouldn't have. So that for me, Gav, those are the three skills that came out of me playing Starcraft and other real-time strategy games that I just, when you asked this question, and I thought it was a fascinating question, I just thought it was a really important to highlight some skills that I know were either learned or perfected through that experience of playing games. And I think a lot of us have those. So those are mine.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. And just to get this out of the way, I also had the Protoss box. So yeah,
yes,
cheers to that. So quick question about the map editor, man. So like you, I spent a lot of time with the map editor, more so with Warcraft 2, but I loved the map editor as well, and making my own campaigns and sort of, scenes in that game. And one of the things that you mentioned was this obviously your background in psych, but also this idea of declarative code. And that kind of evoked for me this question about sort of left brain, right brain ideas. I was kind of wondering if you could speak to how games maybe kind of facilitated your growth along both of those metrics.
I think the map editor for me, there was, and that left brain, right brain dichotomy was really just around seeing not only that I could build logic that was, maybe linear in nature or analytical, but I also could create a lot of art. There were many of the things that I did were artistic. I would play music on some of them. I would do all these things because I really did like to grow both sides. And I think that it was just one of those elements where both my left brain and my right brain got practice there. But I would definitely say that the map editor, it is very much suited for the left brain. You are very engaged on building out that logic and building out those sequences.
So quick question, obviously, just leading off from that, I think both of us use those left brain and right brain skills in different facets, right? How do you use those skills today? So
yeah, I think that being a leader requires more right brain It just does. And people may disagree with that, but I think that you need to be able to be more emotionally intelligent to be an effective leader than intelligent. Steve Jobs used to say, it doesn't make sense to hire smart people and then tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do. And then, of course, John Wooden said, whatever you do in life, surround yourself with smart people who will argue with you. And I think that's a really important principle, is to make sure that you as a leader can gain from the benefits of hiring those types of people.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea that you had about leadership, and because I believe that too. In many ways, the best leaders aren't necessarily the strongest units on the field. They're those who know the strengths of all the other units on the field and can know how to best place them to ensure that everyone is playing to their strengths so that the whole team wins.
Yeah, precisely. And as a leader, if you wait too long, it's one of those situations where you get into those moments of panic, particularly when you're playing against another human.
Right.
Those moments bring in a duress that you have to react to, right? And if you don't react in the right way, you make it worse. You can lose all your units and still win. That happens all the time. But sometimes it's just about delaying them. It's not about winning. You can, a lot of times I would have my brother or my uncle or somebody start attacking me and I knew I wasn't going to win, but I knew that I could make decisions to stall them. And you see this if you play real-time strategy games. A lot of players do this. They'll attack a little bit and then they'll run away a little bit and then they'll attack a little bit and they'll run away a little bit. And it's like you're making a strategic decision to say, I know I'm going to lose, but what I'm trying to do is stall you. And I'm trying to learn more about you, and I'm trying to understand more about you before I come back with what I'm going to do next. And so, yeah, I absolutely think I was aware of it. And I think that it took a while for me to realize how much of an impact that learning that skill of being quicker in decisions and learning while I'm learning, learning what to do while I'm learning what's going on, that really came in those moments of playing those types of games.
Yeah, man, that makes a lot of sense to me. You're getting a model of the real world that way. I mean, it's not like we're out, hunting Zerg or anything, but what it's modeling is, again, the problems of having this paralysis by analysis and have the importance of actually making decisions, because if you never make decisions, then you'll never progress or do anything. Nothing will ever get accomplished. And it's a good immediate feedback system, I think. That's something that you can't get necessarily or as keenly from maybe a movie or a book. You can be taught the importance of that. You can be told a story about something like that, but to actually experience it, to actually have that, I think, is something that makes games different than other media. Talk to me a little bit about what it was like to play with your brother. I don't have a brother. I would have loved one, particularly an older brother, to play with me. I just was wondering if you could speak to that, how important and formative that was for you, having a brother 7 years older play these kind of games with you.
You just said it. He was 7 years older than me. And anyone that has brothers know that it is difficult to find commonalities the longer of a gap between your ages. Now, you were speaking about how your dad was this amazing person, and everything you've told me about him, I think that I can understand how amazing he was just from the few discussions that you and I have had about him. Similarly, I feel a little bit bad about my dad saying this, but who I also revered and still do. But my brother was my hero for a great deal of my childhood. I would always put my brother as my hero. And he was 7 years older than me, and he was very good at trying to keep me engaged in his life despite 7 years. But games was that area that from even a very young child, we just bonded over. We had a 7-year gap, but we could always find ourselves playing games together, sharing laughs and having great times. And countless hours that I played with him, and it was the equalizer for us. And learning to interact with older people came from me playing games with my older brother, he started including me in other things and bringing his friends in to play games with me and stuff like that. And so I got more exposure to hanging out with the older kids. And luckily I had a great role model and a great brother, because sometimes that can go a different way. But the relationship building with somebody 7 years older than me, that lasts for me forever, man. And those memories, I still just have so much fondness looking back at playing games with my brother, despite having this massive age gap between us. We just spent hours doing that.
Games are bridges, man. They bridge gaps from between generations and between, family members. Absolutely. Yeah. And between all of us, right? I didn't even, for example, know that we had the same Protoss box for Starcraft, but that's yet another way in which people can just have these unique connections. It's just amazing that games can do that.
Yeah, so first and foremost, once again, if you stayed with me and Gav to this point, we appreciate you. We are so honored that you will listen to us. And even further, this last week and our very first show, Gav and I, we certainly are new at this. I will say that the comments that we received were just so humbling, and I just felt so grateful for what I received and what Gav received in terms of the encouragement and the positivity. So thank you all for that as well. But
Absolutely. Thank you. It was awesome. It was awesome. Just wanted to repeat that. It was awesome. We loved the comments. We loved the interaction. The support was effusive, and it was very humbling, and it was awesome. So thank you.
I'll first start with, we actually got a video response, Gav. That was super cool. So
yeah, that was, I did not expect that, and it was awesome.
I remember I just had the biggest smile on my face, but our friend Joey Cisco, he sent us a video. I want to play a little bit of it, so I'll play that now.
But my personal game is World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft was not my very first experience with massively online multiplayer gaming, but it was by far the most influential. I played it for over 5,000 hours across a 12-year period. I went on a hiatus when my son was born in 2016 for 9 years, and I am so happy to say that I am playing again, and it's absolutely wonderful and bliss, because it's just a lifestyle. It takes me, I find it to be so adventurous and so whimsical. And really the big thing is that Warcraft grew with me from high school to moving out on my own, to my first relationship, to meeting my wife, to going back to college, to having my children. As I went through each of these events in my life, there'd be a new Warcraft expansion and a new aspect of Warcraft for me to get excited about. And it's not even just that. Consider when I started playing in 2005, there was a character named Anduin Wrynn. And Anduin was the Prince of Stormwind. He was a little boy, 10 years old. His father was missing. Okay? That was when the game first came out. We're 10 expansions deep, and 20 years later, Anduin has grown up. He's a 25-year-old man.
Wow, Gav, it's so incredible to me to hear how a game like World of Warcraft, which I played too much in my college years, I played that game to a point that it was unhealthy levels, but there was a time where everybody that I knew played it, and I can certainly understand how that game could be more than a game. And I loved what Joey said about how it evolved with him as a person, and he's relating it to things like his wedding and those things. That is so cool, right?
Yes.
Those memories are lockstep with your game, and to carry that game for decades, that makes sense of why that game is more than a game to him. And I just thought that was so cool.
It was really touching to see that. And I mean, to have a character grow up with you, it's almost like, again, having almost like another sibling. It must be like, right? To have this person that you've known since you've been a little kid, and you watch them grow and expand and morph before your very eyes. It's an incredible experience. So Joey, thank you so much for that video. It was moving. It was awesome. And I watched it multiple times. I loved everything about that video. So another comment we got was from Nerd House. Thank you for your comment. And Nerd House said, for him, the games that were more than games were Earthbound and Mega Man X. Oh. And amazing games. He says that both shaped me as a gamer and defined my tastes and genres that I enjoy most. Growing up with both of these games were frequently in my Super Nintendo and were replayed over and over during some very rough times in his life, and they saved him. And so I know, Zeff, Earthbound means a lot to you. So I loved hearing this because both games are, first of all, amazing games. I love both of those games. I love them because they're not necessarily the first picks that some people might not have, right? At least, that you see every day, but they're very well-known games and they're very popular games and they are very good games. And they're very, I would say, critical games to their respective genres. I mean, we haven't really seen a game like Earthbound, or Mother 3 for that matter, sort of since that series. I just thought that those were really unique picks. And obviously Mega Man X basically, defined that space, which is a wonderful transformation of, games from the regular Nintendo, the NES, to the Super Nintendo, and to see how that series evolved into the Super Nintendo was outstanding.
So Nerd House, first of all, thank you, and we're best friends just on that inclusion alone. I can tell you, and for anyone listening, Earthbound has a very special significance to me. It is definitely one of my favorite games of all time. It's part of my gamer tag of ZeffEpics. It's the E. It is such an important game to me, and I understand how anyone can say the phrase, "it saved me." And if you've played it, you understand why. And if you haven't, please go play Earthbound. It is such an important game. And it's a little quirky. And if you've never played anything like it, there's an initial getting over the weird at the beginning. But the stories and the music and the messages and the themes and the symbolism that it has are unlike any game for me. And that's why it's such an important game to me. So love that comment. Thank you, Nerd House.
Yep.
The next one was from our friend Madonna Loves Games. And hers was very touching, so I'm just going to read it. But she talked about Final Fantasy X, another one of my great passions, love, and Xenogears. She says they're more than just...
Both of those are winners.
Yes.
Both of those games.
She nailed it, right, with those two. But Final Fantasy X, I could talk about that game forever. But Final Fantasy X and Xenogears are more than just games in my life. I went through a lot coming up, losing my mom, to losing our home, to finding a place in a different city for myself and my younger brother to live. Wow. My coworkers were going on fun trips with their families while I was arranging the funeral for my mother. My gosh, I'm so sorry. Really rough stuff, but I agree about, and this is to you, Gav. You talked about how your father said a kind word can change the world. Your dad's lovely quote that I love, but he says, I agree about staying positive and trying to be grateful even for little things. And she talks about the concept of doing a compliment drive-by. She also took a 10-year hiatus from games, and her husband bought her a PlayStation 5 and got back into FF16, which is good husband move. So husbands,
she's in good company. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, husbands, if your wife was ever a gamer, go get her a system, right? Like, that's a great way to keep all the magic alive. But first of all, thank you for sharing your personal story. I can certainly understand not only why you needed games through all that, but also, wow, a game like FF10, the Final Fantasy X, and the emotions that game brings while also having those emotions in your life, I can understand how that could be a wonderful solace or medicine, as you kept talking about in the last show. So great choices.
Yeah, I mean, Final Fantasy X, if you're going through with something tough in your life, that would be a pretty evocative game for you. So that comment makes a lot of sense. That was a very touching and moving comment. So thank you for that, Madonna. I think the last comment we got, or one of them about the actual responding to our question, was from Xavier, or Master Game 5X. He said, I played The Legend of Dragoon every October in honor of my mom. She passed away October 3rd, 2016. My mom used to watch me play The Legend of Dragoon back when I was 8 or 9, and she used to end up falling asleep to it due to probably being sick. She was comfortable, and she used to enjoy watching me play, and that is a bright memory in my mind. So this comment meant a lot to me, obviously because of what happened with my dad in 2008. And I really appreciated this comment because it was something that I think speaks to what we had talked about earlier, Zeff, which is this idea of games reaching across generations and reaching across time. I mean, this is something that Xavier would have with his mom, who unfortunately passed away, and the games that he plays and still play The Legend of Dragoon remind him of his mom in very similar ways as The Legend of Zelda are, for me, are going to be inextricably linked with my dad. I can't not think of my dad when I play those games. And it's very similar to him, where Xavier, where he plays Legend of Dragoon every October. There was a long time, and I only had actually kind of recently stopped, where I would play Zelda 2 every Christmas Eve, beginning when I was about 7 until even after I graduated college. It's just something I did. I beat The Legend of Zelda 2 every Christmas Eve. It's just what I did. And so having those habitual games that you go to that have an emotional place with you, I really resonate with that idea. And just to see how he had Xavier had a very similar reaction and very similar sort of let's say routine that he has with The Legend of Dragoon that I had with Zelda 2, and the similarities between his mom and my dad really just it was something that it was difficult to read, but he's obviously made his peace with it, and it just shows how games have the power to do, again, more than just be pixels on a screen and lights flashing in our face, and give us strength and remind us of memories when we need it. So thank you again for that really lovely comment. It was very, very moving for me, Xavier.
Yeah, Xavier, honestly, just what a wonderful tribute to the memory of your mother. And when I read it, I told Gav, I was like, this is almost hard to read. It's so moving. And I just, what a wonderful way of using games as the tool that we talked about here, Gav, of using it as the mechanism or the vehicle to honor somebody. And I'm sure that there are special memories with that game that have helped you. And I just thank you so much for sharing it with us. We appreciate you, and we appreciate that comment. It really moved both of us, and I just wanted to say thank you as well. Please send in your comments for this week's topic. What skills did you learn from video games, and what games did they come from? We'd love to hear from you. We'll definitely read more comments next week. And this has been really, I really enjoy this part of like hearing from the audience. That was what this was all about. Like we all learned together, right? And so thank you all again for the comments, and please let us know your thoughts. Gav, anything you want to say before we go?
No, just again, thank you very much for your comments. We really appreciate them. We read them all. We love them, and it lets us know that it's just a nice way to interact with people. And I just love hearing people's stories about these things. These are lessons that sometimes people don't talk about when they talk about video games. They talk about more the mechanical aspects, how to beat a boss and whatever. But these ideas are what motivated the entire purpose of the podcast, Zeff, which is these lessons that we learn, the memories that we have, and things that we can glean from games as games for those reasons. Thank you so much for the comments.
Until next time, thank you.
Until next time, see ya.